I'm excited to talk about how to graduate number one in your law school class. And what we're going to do in this session is talk about 5 key principles for graduating at the top of your class. Before we talk about those principles though, I just want to dispel 2 myths that I sometimes hear about people who graduate at the top of their class. The first myth is, to graduate at the top of your class, you must have been the smartest law student. And the second myth is, to graduate at the top of your class, you must work the longest hours. And both of those are false. When I went to law school, I was definitely not the smartest person in my class. I remember a lot of times I'd go to class, I'd be really confused by what went on, and all my friends would understand it, and I'd have to go home and study my notes for 2 hours. Okay, so I was definitely not the smartest person. People caught on more quickly, and it was more intuitive for other people. Secondly, I did not work the longest hours. While I worked extremely hard in law school and I made studying a priority, I also took every single Sunday off. So Sunday was my break day. I would get up late, I'd hang out with my friends, hang out with my sisters, I would do chores, but I would not study on Sundays. And I found that this re-energized me for the rest of the week and motivated me to work really hard the other 6 days of the week, knowing that I had this full day off. But I did not work the longest hours. So you do not necessarily need to be the smartest person in your class, and you don't necessarily need to work the hardest to graduate at the top of your class. Instead, what's much more important is that you have a good strategy. If you have a good strategy, you can use that strategy to study the most effectively and excel on law school exams. So we're going to talk about that strategy in this course. Our whole course is centered around this strategy. But what we're going to talk about here is 5 principles for succeeding in law school. So the first principle is that success in law school is success on law school final exams. So keep in mind that if you want to do well in law school, you have to do well on the final exam. Your final exam is, in most cases, the only thing that will be graded in your substantive law school classes. So for most of your classes, torts, crim law, contracts, con law, real property, civ pro, generally speaking, you will only have one final exam graded at the end, and that final exam will determine 100% of your grade. You don't have written assignments. You're not graded over the course of the semester. You're only graded at the end of the semester. Now, obviously, check your syllabus because it's possible your professor may have changed that, but that's how the traditional law school class is given. Just that one final grade, final exam at the end determines your whole final grade. So that means, it might sound crazy, but you need to focus on that final exam from day 1 of law school. You have to be thinking about that final exam and studying for it from day 1. What else is there to focus on? That's the only thing that matters in terms of your grades. Okay, so that's the first principle. The second principle is law school exams test how well you know the law and how well you can apply it. Okay, so what you're focusing on is that law school final exam at the end of the semester, which means what you're focusing on is, do you know the law and can you apply it? There are really 2 things that you need to do to learn the law, and that is outline. So create a beautiful outline, mostly from your class notes, and memorize that outline. So that's how you learn the law. You have an outline and then you commit it to memory. You memorize all the rules in that outline. And then you have to practice that strategy of applying what you know to final exams. So you have to learn a good exam taking strategy, which is IRAC, which we'll talk about this in this course. And then you have to practice it. You actually have to take a bunch of law school final exams. All right, so principle number 1 is your law school final exam is all that really matters. And principle number 2 is focus on how to study for that from day 1. So focus on outlining and memorizing your outlines and focus on learning a strategy for taking exams and practicing that strategy. This brings us naturally to principle number 3, which is that you cannot do everything. So in law school, you might feel overwhelmed with the amount of work that's given. You're going to be assigned a bunch of cases. You're going to wonder if you should brief every single case that you're assigned. You're going to want to prepare to be called on in class. So you're going to want to read the cases really carefully in some instances because you're going to be worried that you're going to be called on. Then you might want to join a study group. Okay, a lot of study groups talk about the cases. So you're going to wonder, when do I have time for all of this? How am I supposed to read every case, brief every case, prepare to be on call, join a study group, outline, learn my outline, learn this IRAC strategy, and practice it throughout the semester? And the answer is you cannot do everything. So what you have to do is prioritize what's going to help you do well in law school, which is outlining, learning your outlines, and then practicing those exams. That's what you have to prioritize. The rest of it, the cases, the reading cases, briefing cases, preparing to be on call, joining study groups that talk about cases, you still, of course, want to prepare for class, but those are not a priority. You cannot do everything because you have only so many hours in a day. So you have to prioritize what's gonna most likely lead to a high final exam. And again, we're going to talk about how to do that in this course. Principle number 4 is you have to be okay with not following the crowd. This was hard for me when I was in law school. I remember, especially at the beginning of the semester, every single person around me was briefing cases. And I would go and walk through the library. I didn't like to study in the library, so I almost never studied in there. But every single person in the library had their case books open, and all they would do all day was brief cases. And I never briefed a case, hardly ever, after my first week of law school. I just didn't even occur to me to brief cases. It seemed so inefficient. And it would make me nervous sometimes to see all these people working so hard at briefing cases, and I wasn't doing it at all. I'd think, am I missing something? Like, should I be doing that? But I'd have to remind myself, it's okay to not follow the crowd. Only 5% of people in your law school class are going to graduate at the top 5% of your class. So you have to do something different if you want to set yourself apart. So keep that in mind throughout law school, because you might find yourself getting nervous if you see other people spending their time on kind of activities that are not very productive, and you might be wondering if you should be doing the same thing. And the answer is no. You need to focus on a strategy that's going to help you excel and succeed on those law school final exams. Okay, principle number 5 is the number one thing to focus on is what your professor says in class. A lot of people kind of lose sight of this, but think about it. Your professor writes your law school exams. Your professor grades your law school exams. Your professor is going to want to see their own words repeated back to them on those law school final exams. So you want to focus on what your professor says in class. Some professors say anything in the casebook is fair game. And that might be true to a degree, but really what they're going to spend their time testing on is what they talk about in class. So your most important resource, your number one resource, is your class notes. Anything else, any supplement, any outline, any commercial outline or study tool is just secondary. The only way you should be using those is to clarify your class notes or clarify something your professor talked about in class. But your professor will not test on something in any large degree that was not covered in class. So you want to focus on those class notes, and you want to focus on what your professor says. That's by far the most important resource that you have. Okay, so in this class, what we're going to do is talk about this skill to succeed in law school. And we're going to talk about the strategy that you want to use from day one of law school. But it helps to keep these 5 principles in mind because we'll be coming back to them over and over again throughout this course.